I guess I'm bleeding. It's all just really gross and uncomfortable. I can get behind the idea that sometimes literature has to be uncomfortable in order to make the point that it's making, but I can't tell what the point of this book is making. And like, Redmond winnows back and forth so many times between hating the hallucination of Ned because Ned is a murdering child molester and finding no fault in him because how could old Pappy be such a monster? He just enjoyed the company of the kid. He wanted to have a son of his own, and this kid was fulfilling that place for him, and he couldn't possibly have been sexually attracted to him. And this says something about mirroring. I mean, after all, technically, we don't actually know that he's killed his wife and child. It's left to us to figure that out using context and subtext, rather than having to actually spell it out with the words, and then he killed them. However, with as much identifying with Ned as Redmond ends up doing, it gives me a sort of really heebie-jeebie gross vibe that he molested and then killed his daughter, and might also still be having sex with the corpse of his daughter and or wife in the magical kingdom of Winterwood? Gross? Some critics of the things that I say will say that they didn't actually get any of idea that he may have molested his daughter, but then what's the whole point of him identifying with the child molesting murderer the entire time like he has? If not to make that parallel. I feel like overlooking that is folly, and saying that there's no evidence for it and that you didn't see any of it is just saying that you didn't read the text close enough. But then there's also this theme of spiraling into delusion. It starts with the first hallucination when he's in a hotel and he smells the old tobacco smoke, the kind of like musty, moldy smell that I guess he remembers from when he was hanging out with old Pappy in his hut drinking the old clear or whatever it was called. And then, like, the fact that he does all of this intense stalking makes it very clear that Redmond has other mental health issues outside of just this paranoid ghost-seeing delusion. Now, obviously, I am no expert in mental health aberrations, but I have had my share of actual real-life stalkers in real life, and this seems pretty accurate to someone who is so gravely mentally ill as to want to stalk somebody. Technically, Redmond doesn't qualify for the title of serial killer because, according to what we know, he's only actually killed 2 people in this specific way that we know about. He does exhibit a lot of the other traits that serial killers possess. A proclivity for psychotic breaks, where a person believes that they are being physically or else are controlled by another person, is a distinguishing commonality between serial killers. Because it's never that they did it themselves, it's that they were made to do it, or that they were someone else when they did it. And this whole dissociative break thing, where Redmond sees Ned's ghost, I mean, that could be psychotic break territory right there. Which brings us to the last chapter, where it tells us about Redmond's death from the perspective of the so-called ghost of Ned. Arguably the worst part of a book where all of the parts are the worst part. You see, up until this part in the book, everything's been narrated by Redmond as he experiences it in the first person, happening at the time that he tells it, right? Like, I go any point in the book, and it says, I lowered my head in abject humility. Yes, of course, I know, I replied and resumed my journey in the echo-speckled dusk. Move on to somewhere closer to the end. I did, as a matter of fact, and was triumphant at last to be in a position to trump him. Yes, I replied cockily, right? But then you get to the very last chapter. It was the 22nd of February 2004, and there could be no doubt about it, Redmond Hatch was just about the happiest man alive. He was positively glowing with happiness as he boarded the tube train, blah, blah, blah. This is jarring and distracting and switches the viewpoints to be told by Ned, or so we are to understand. And it is because of this garbage transition that I know some people are going to argue that the hallucinations were actually real and actually a ghost this whole time. Like, he was actually there, don't you see? The last chapter of the book proves it. It's been a little while since I've had to use that graphic. But, like, no, though. This ending is what happens when you get to where a story should end, and the author's like, I don't know how to end the story. Let's throw an M. Night Shyamalan-style twist on it to try to make it sound like it's more profound than it actually is. That totally works and is not both trite and out of place. There we go. Sign that one, put your thumbprint on it, and send it to the publisher. And it doesn't add anything to the book. All it does is say, well, since he's dead now, you, the audience, will be happy to know that he has to experience his afterlife in the same place as Ned, like his own personal hell. But like, what's the point? Like, the whole time in the book we've seen Redmond stumbling and falling into the same steps that Ned took. Wife beating, child killing, heavy drinking, living a double life. At the end, the big lesson is, what? Don't imitate the life of a child molester? I didn't think I'd have to spell that one out for you, my dude. According to the seminar in which this book is being discussed, the way that Redmond descends into his eventual downfall reflects the effects of the so-called Celtic tiger, which is a thing that happened in Ireland's recent history, where there's like an economic roller coaster that saw a swell in economic growth, followed by a property bubbles bursting and then a pitch decline. But to say that the whole book is following this rise and fall of the economy is both new historicist, and therefore irrelevant to the wider audience of human people who read books, and kind of absurd, since poverty and obsessive murder pedophilia are not intrinsically linked in any sort of meaningful way that can denote an identity of being Irish derived from the same flow and spike decline. Like, no, the new criticism school says that one should not need to look at anything outside the text itself in order to be able to effectively criticize and discuss it, and to a great extent I think that the modern audience for literature fits into this camp. Let the work stand on its own merits contained within its own words. Which leads me to the point that I'd like to make, which is, Winterwood is not an Irish horror book. It's not horror, and it's only Irish because they're in places like Dublin and Temple Bar and Slievenagia. But this story could have happened anywhere. It is not uniquely Irish, and there's nothing in this story that makes me think, ah, yes, Ireland, because it could very well just have happened the same way in a rural town in Appalachia, or in Germany, or in France, or in feudal Japan. There's nothing uniquely Irish about this book, and so I am confused as to why it is in the seminar at all. And frankly, several of the students that I've talked to in the groups that we've had to do during class for group discussions agree with this point. There's no real reason why this book specifically should have been put into the curriculum of the class, except for that the class wanted to try to make a point of joining this with the so-called Celtic tiger, but like, I could liken the way that this book flows to any number of other historical things as well and say, oh no, that actually follows this instead. Or I could go back to my biggest pet peeve and point to how this whole book is actually revolving around the 7 deadly sins. Like, I hate how you can do with everything. Or I can even go back to my Christian high school days and say that this book is actually a Christ allegory. I'm sure I could do it. It might be difficult because this book is only full of scumbags, but I'm sure I could do it because you can contrive anything to mean anything when you're doing literary criticism. So to say very specifically that this book is this is absurd. Back to the point that I was making earlier, this book isn't horror. Much in the same way that Seamus Dean's book, Reading in the Dark, is not horror, but has elements of the Gothic in it, Winterwood is something closer to a psychological thriller than a horror, and I cannot wait for the discourse that will surround the next statement that I make. Stop labeling trauma and thrill as horror. This isn't horror, it's just uncomfortable. And I mean, yes, as we mentioned, it's got Gothic elements in it, especially in connections to, like, madness and violence and masculinity and that sort of business, but it is lacking the element of the unexplained that makes it into horror. But Vincent, I hear you cry, you didn't talk about all the important things in the book, like how Imogen's favorite show was My Little Pony and that influenced the name of the Secret Kingdom, or how he met someone at the pizza place and gave away some of his identity and that's how his whole thing got unraveled, or how his second wife was probably cheating on him as well, and so it really wasn't his fault that all this stuff happened to him, and yes, you're right, I didn't, because none of that's important to the story. like, at all. If you really have to read this story, you will find that it's rambly. There are entire sections that could have been edited out completely with no change to the story. I'm looking at you, chapter 3 and 4, that could have been reduced together to be like 3 pages. And it harps on the gross sexual predator parts a lot. So there. I said it, and I will stick to it. People need to stop using trauma to try to artificially create horror, because it isn't, and it doesn't. McCabe has written a bunch of other stuff, and I can't speak for any of it because I haven't read any of it else, but he's been listed for the Booker Prize for 2 of his books. Neither of them were this one. And really, literary awards are just completely meaningless and do not actually give any indication as to the actual readability and goodness of a book, because 9 times out of 10 they're just a bunch of stuffy white heteronormative guys in a room being like, yes, this book conforms to our ideas of what literary fiction should be. If you want to listen to 242 pages of stream of consciousness, self-indulgent, unreliable narration given by a thoroughly boring, criminally insane murderer and possibly pedophile, then I guess I've got a book for you. I'll be honest with you guys, I don't know if I actually like just tearing books new assholes all the time, but it seems like that's what my lot in life has come to be recently, so I hope that you enjoy it, because it gets my blood pressure up, and I know that a fun thing to do on YouTube is to yell about stuff, so yeah. I don't know, I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you guys very much for coming and watching. Look out for some more books coming up soon. We've got to talk about Frank Kissstein as well, and that's a super problematic book. But there are some good books coming, I promise. I'm also developing a class that if I don't get it picked up by the university, then I'll try to develop it and put it on Udemy or something like that as well, about popular literature and why it's important to the wider scene for literature as well. But anyway, thank you guys so much for coming and watching. I hope that you enjoyed it. Look out for more book stuff soon. I also think I'm going to make a couple videos talking about the lore in Genshin Impact soon, so look forward to that. And I will see you next time.